Now we're going to start off with this first roundtable, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Frank, perhaps around 10 minutes or so. Doctor, why don't you tell us a bit about your background, how you got involved in this whole thing? What are your thoughts about Tina, and what has really transpired over the last few years related to forensic images, and in particular, Tina Peters?
Thanks for asking. I'm a physicist, I'm a scientist, I design and build electronics for a living, so I'm no stranger to technology. I was one of the first 300 people on the internet, so I've been around a while. So my favorite thing to do is to model. I love large data sets. I love what I call swimming in the data. So during 2020, during the COVID epidemic, I was modeling using differential equations the epidemic all around the world, 30 countries, and every single county in America. And so that I had about 150,000 unique followers on social media. We got the state health director of Ohio fired and stuff like this. I was very engaged, and that's what kind of brought me into the public eye in 2020. And then the election happened. Oh, but I left out something important. Sharona Bishop and I worked together in the state of Colorado to fight off the state's attempt to close down the churches. I wrote the technical briefs to challenge the claims that the state was making to try to shut down churches. So that's important to the story. That's how I met Sharona in the first place. And so we were doing podcasts together. We were writing briefs. We were fighting the state. And we successfully kept the connection to Mesa County. So then when the election happened in 2020, and the state of Pennsylvania legislature brought me in to do an analysis of their election. I was part of their audit there, and I discovered all kinds of crazy things. It wasn't just me. I was part of a team of 6 people, and we just uncovered a huge amount of fraud, and my specialty was the voter rolls, and I was able to show that the voter rolls were being manipulated to control the election. So that's kind of what got me into the elections. I was introduced through COVID and then the elections. One of the things that my starting assumption, and I think a lot of us had this mistaken assumption, was that the election in Pennsylvania, of course, was stolen, and maybe some of the other states, but I was expecting to be able to find clean elections somewhere in the country. And so after Pennsylvania, I did Florida, North Carolina, Ohio. I went around to all these states expecting to be able to find clean elections. I'm a scientist, and as a scientist and statistician for controls in my statistics, and I couldn't find it. So one day I had to, because I knew Sharona already, I called up Sharona and said, hey, you're in a very conservative county. Mesa County is like 2-1 Republican, very conservative. I said, tell me about your election, because I'm looking for a clean county somewhere. And she burst into tears. She said, oh, Dr. Frank, it's horrible. Our elections are horrible. Something's wrong with our elections. Would you please come help us? So we arranged for a visit. I flew out to Mesa County, and I spent 3 days traveling around with her. She arranged meetings for me to I spoke to small church groups that typically 50 people would show up in the mornings. And then in the afternoons, we would go knock on doors. And I had already acquired data for the state of Colorado and processed it. And we were knocking on suspicious doors, and we were finding exactly what we expected to find. People who were not real residents who were voting, people who didn't exist who were voting, things like this. So we were confirming confirming with boots on the ground what I had found in the voter rolls. So because we were having so much success with that, Sharona contacted Tina Peters, and that's I just needed to give you that backup so you can see how I got involved in this. So we sat down. She set up a meeting. And by the way, I also trial. About 500 people attended, and I thought it was a great start to a movement there. And I met. Then it was a private meeting in Tina Peters' office. It was just a few of us, and I presented the evidence we had found so far. I presented my statistical evidence. And it didn't take us long to convince Tina that there were serious issues in her elections. And that's a long story, which Mark asked me to keep this to 10 minutes. So I'm going to leave out a lot of those details, but we can talk about it another time if you like. But it didn't take us long to convince her that there was a problem with her election. Why? Because she was already suspicious, because they had just run county elections, and there were anomalous things that happened in that election. So she was already aware something's not right here, but But just like a lot of county officials, they really don't understand all the systems. And so when I brought it all together for her, she was like, oh my goodness, we got to do something about this. And I just want to say right at the outset, I was so impressed with Tina Peters in that meeting. She was obviously she was brimming with integrity. She wasn't like a lot of clerks I've met. They're like, don't talk to me. I don't want to address any problems with our election. She was like, if you have a problem, bring me the evidence. We're going to look into anything. If there's any there, I'm going to expose it and we're going to address it. So I was so impressed by her in that meeting. And so after we kind of got past the evidence phase of our discussion, she was like, okay, now what do we do? And I said, well, this was now April of 2021. I said, well, definitely, you've got a problem. We know we got a problem. We better get everything backed up because you have an election coming up in a month. It's in May. They were going to have another election. And we don't want to lose any of the evidence. Obviously, we're going to be having an investigation. And so you've got to preserve the evidence. She says, funny thing you mentioned that. I've got a letter here from the state of Colorado telling me all the clerks have to back up their data, back up their evidence, because we have this trusted build that's going to come in and Dominion's going to be working in our systems. We need to have everything back. Do you know how to do this stuff? Well, like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a computer expert. I know how to do this kind of stuff. But what had happened is I had the opportunity to meet with some pretty sophisticated folks. We got one of them with us today, Clerk. We've got really good technical people around the country who had already been working in election systems. So I said to her, look, I can try and I can do the job, but I would much rather bring in someone who has a lot more experience than me with these machines. Plus, if we're going to be doing an audit, a full forensic audit kind of thing, we need to bring in attorneys on this because we don't want to mess anything up. There's this doctrine in law that it's a fruit from the poisonous tree. If you do anything wrong in your data collection phase, it can affect your ability to bring it into trial later. So I didn't want to make any mistakes. And I was very familiar with Kurt Olson at that point. He and I had spent a lot of time together, and I had met a cybersecurity expert, and he and I had hit it off pretty well in some of my private meetings. And I know everybody knows who that was, but I swore to him that I would never use his name in public, so I'm not using his name now. I'm just going to call him our cyber expert. But anyway, I know his name's come up a lot lately in a lot of podcasts, but I promised I'm keeping my promise. So anyway, what happened was then Tina, she agreed that I would help her with that. And then after I left, we exchanged information so we could stay in contact. And then after I left, she contacted her own IT department to have them do the backups for her. And they refused. And I don't know why they refused. I don't know whether they were afraid, whether they didn't have the capability or whatever, but they refused. So then she went out and got Gerald Wood, who you know from the trial. He agreed that he would do the backups. And so that was kind of, she was pursuing multiple paths to get the data backed up. Her own IT department wouldn't do it. She would get Gerald Wood to do it. But she and I were still staying in contact because I had made a strong argument that we need to not bring in somebody who has no experience with these machines. We needed to bring in someone quite experienced, and we also wanted the legal guidance along the way. And I know that Kurt advised her, and you can tell by the steps she took about Tina's integrity, because she was being really careful to follow all of the details. There are all these rules about who can be in the room, when, and all this sort of thing. And so she contacted the state and got permission, made sure that all of the requirements for having someone observe were met. Now, we have one thing that's different about this case, and I want to compare it to another case that I handled, which most people don't know about. It's Lake County, Ohio. But before I talk about that, I just want to say one thing about this. Our expert agreed to do this backup and to monitor the trusted build that was going to take place on condition that he remained anonymous. He was not you didn't want people to know who he was. He was involved in other things, and he has high security clearances and whatnot. He didn't want anybody to know who did it, but he was willing to help. So Tina, she had acquired a badge for Gerald Wood. She used his badge for some of the entry of our expert, and that did get her into trouble later. But you got to realize she had the authority to bring him in anytime anyway. So it was more of a convenience thing. It was not like a fraudulent thing where she was trying to do something bad. And you'll notice that in the trial, she was acquitted. She was not found guilty of identity identity theft, because that obviously was not the intent, and she didn't really cross any lines there. But anyway, that's where that comes in. So that our expert that we brought in to do all the backups and the forensic images we preserved his anonymity. And it's true that throughout that process, of course, Gerald Wood and Sharona Bishop and Tina Peters were working together to make that all happen. So, and a lot of that came out in the trial, so I don't need to go over that again. But my involvement was basically making sure that the right people were brought in at the right time. And I just want to contrast what happened here with what happened in Lake County, Ohio. So I was contacted by the Lake County, Ohio. And those officials contacted me and said, gee, Dr. Frank, can you show that our machines are vulnerable as well? I used the same guy, and he went in at the request of the county. And during their spring election, he hacked into their election. It's like Clay said, he's an ethical hacker. It's like a white hacking. It's a penetration test, they call it. And during the election, he demonstrated that all of their Dominion machines, same machines as Tina had, were online throughout the election and were manipulatable in the same ways that Mark has shown so often with the SQL management server. He could manipulate the whole election. We documented all that, and we gave it to the county officials in Lee County. And when they took that to the state, Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, he didn't go, oh my goodness, we have a huge problem, we got to address our elections. He called in the FBI. The FBI came in and did a full investigation, and you'll notice nobody was prosecuted in that case. Why? Because it was at the request of the county officials. The guy is fully licensed. He's a licensed white hat hacker. He's a licensed penetration tester. He did it at the request of the county. Everything was above board. So guess what? No charges, no nothing. Now, why would there be no charges in that case and charges in Tina's case? And the answer is right out of the mouth of Rubenstein, the prosecuting attorney. He said in public, we're making a public example out of Tina Peters. We are going to scare every other clerk in this country from ever allowing anything like this to happen again. And I can vouch, because I've met, in my introduction you heard, I've met with hundreds of clerks around the country, and they all say the same thing to me. We bring them evidence of fraud, and their faces go white. The blood drains from their face. And they say, oh my goodness, Dr. Frank, I don't want to be Tina Peters. She's become a verb, okay? And that is exactly why they have done this to Tina Peters. They trumped up charges against her. And I'll just finish with this, because I know I don't want to run too long. There's so much more I can tell, but I those early details, I think, were not brought out in the trial. I was never allowed to testify. And I told people, I told people for years, Tina Peters' case will never go to trial, because if it does go to trial, we'll be able to put in all this evidence. And there's no way they can convict her once we put all the evidence in. But that kind of shows my naivete, because I'm a physicist, not an attorney. David probably wouldn't have made this mistake. Because what happened was the attorneys had all these pre-trial hearings, and they got all of the exculpatory evidence removed from the trial. So, in other words, every time evidence could come out that would defend Tina, there would be a claim or that they were investigating, and the defense attorneys would stand up and say, here's what evidence we want to present. Then the prosecuting attorney would say, we object, Your Honor. That was ruled out in pre-trial. And so what I didn't anticipate was that they would basically rig the trial before it went to trial. And that's why Tina was able to be convicted. And you noticed in the sentencing trial, which, by the way, I gave a 10-minute testimony during that sentencing trial. You can see it on my YouTube page if you want. It's about 10 minutes. But you noticed that even in her comments, she said she forgives the jury because the evidence they got was only one-sided. So to me, to me, the trial was not a trial. It was a mockery of justice. And all of the exculpatory evidence that could have been brought forward that would have exonerated her behavior and showed that she was doing her best at every stage of the way to dot every I and cross every T, it was in her interest to do so, because she knew that we were going to be doing a legal investigation. So she didn't want to violate any of the rules. She was doing her best. That's why she called the state, by the way, to verify how many people can be in the room when and who can be there and whatnot. She did her due diligence at every step of the way. The only thing she did that sounded shady but wasn't was that she protected the identity of the expert that we brought in, and at his request and the anonymity request either, which I think is very interesting, because if he had been brought and to testify, we could have had that. But all of the kinds of things that could have given her exculpatory evidence, including an over an hour long recording of me in that meeting. I didn't know that meeting was recorded, by the way. All of that evidence was not brought to light. And so a fair hearing was never given to her. What I tried to do is catch everybody up to that point. We got the forensic images. By the way, those forensic images are available online to the public if you want to see those. It was brought up at the Cyber Symposium, and that's when I know Mark. I first met Mark and Doug Gould. A lot of the people joined at that time. So my job, I think, in my first little segment here was to catch everybody up to that point. And then a lot of things began to happen at that point when Tina Peters came and made a public whistleblower statement. So I think that's a good overview to get us caught up.